Welcome to the Insum Insider.
Welcome to the Inside. This is the Insum Insider, your source for Oracle Apex tips, techniques, methodology, and really anywhere that discussion takes us. I'm your host, Monty Latchley, coming to you from an undisclosed location outside of Houston, Texas. I might as well tell you we're on the northwest side of Houston. Sharing the screen with me today is my good friend, member of the Insum family, Michelle Scamany. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Monty.
At the helm, keeping us on time and task, it's our producer, French-Canadian, Mark Rule.
Hello, both. Hello, everyone.
Hello, Mark.
Hey, Mark.
It's Thursday, May 7th. And thank you for spending a piece of your afternoon with us, coming through through the miracle of Zoom teleconferencing. We're not going to do the product spot this week, Michelle.
I'm very grateful.
Yeah, we are another week into this thing. How's another week in quarantine treating you?
Good, except I'm really in desperate need of a haircut. I'm kind of admiring or envious of you with your hat on, because we don't know what's going on under there. I'm going to assume it's getting longer like mine.
Oh, contraire, mon frère. I cut my own hair last night. It's actually not bad. It's not perfect, but it's much improved. Actually, I used the Panasonic J12.
You aren't going to do another product placement. What are you doing?
You knew there was going to be a product placement here with 8 blade attachments, 5,600 RPMs, available at Walgreens and CVS near you. All right.
I almost cannot believe you just did that. The check better be coming in.
All right. Now, we can't assume that everyone's been with us on this journey from the start. So could you take just a second, Michelle, like you did last week, and just tell people about the live stream, tell people about the forum, and then we'll get on to the main event.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep it short because I think probably a lot of people have been with us for the last couple of weeks, but we are running these weekly live streams every Thursday at 2:00. We're trying to keep it quite conversational, moving away from the 1-hour webinar format. The main thing that I wanted to tell you about is you've all signed up at our Insum Insider website. That's really your main resource for all things Insider. It's where we'll publish the schedule, where we publish the Zoom links. We are also hopefully doing a good enough job emailing you guys regularly and reminding you. But it's also where we upload the recordings after every show, and it's where you'll find our community forum. So please feel free to use that, after every episode or even anytime during the program. Go there if you have any questions, comments about what we're doing. We're eager to hear about any topics that you're interested in hearing about. We're still finalizing the schedule of the last few weeks, so we're open to any suggestions, and that's it. Hope you guys make really good use of that forum and that platform.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for making this a reality. We've got a large team behind us. It's not just obviously it's not just you, I, and Mark that are participating in this effort. So thanks to you, and thanks to everyone involved. We're going to bring into the screen now Anton Nielsen. Anton is Insum's own Vice President of Consulting Services. He's somebody that is very, very, very passionate about things like code reviews and building process and standards into what we do. Anton, we're going to kind of use you to kind of set the table for what Rich and what Lance are going to discuss. I know that you've really been instrumental in raising our game at Insum in the area of code review.
Well, thanks very much. I'm, as you said, passionate about it, and for a lot of reasons. Not just about improving our code, but really about improving our work environment for everybody that's involved. So that's a big piece of what we do is developing great applications, but also developing our people and providing a good work environment. And believe it or not, code reviews are a piece of that. So.
Yep. Well, Michelle and I, we write bug-free code, right, Michelle?
I know I do. I don't know about you.
Oh, of course we don't. But the point
The
is,
worst code, worst code to review is your own.
true, true, true. Well, where I was going is, it's not just about finding bugs in your code either. It's not just saying this code doesn't work. Presumably that would have been found, by the developer doing their own unit testing. It's about conventions and standards within your codes as well.
Certainly true. Yeah. Yes. And really, it's about sharing the community of knowledge that we have, particularly when we talk about peer code reviews. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that in the process, and how we ended up focusing on a peer code review and why as well. So.
Well, one of the when we kind of put this session together, one of the examples that I came up with is from the sports world, which I know you like, Anton. But it was I used to live in San Antonio, and the San Antonio Spurs was an NBA team. That's basketball, an NBA team, and they have a fantastic culture that they've put in place. And people that are really into sports, the San Antonio Spurs are really held up as really the poster child for developing these cultures. And one of the things that they do is, whether you're the highest paid player on the team with the superstar or whatever, or you're just a first year rookie that's coming on, you really kind of everybody gets kind of the same the same treatment. The process is the same for the rookie versus the superstar. Everyone on that team is always is taught to be extremely coachable. And I think that translates into code review as well. The guy that's been doing this for 20 years, he should be held to the same standard as someone who's just joined the company and is less experienced.
That's right. And in fact, one of the things I really enjoy about our peer code review process is that everybody is expected to participate as both a reviewer and as a code producer. So I have the opportunity to have my code reviewed by people like Rich Soul, who, my goal when I'm, having my code reviewed by Rich is actually to teach Rich something, but rarely it's usually the other way around. I'm learning, but it's great to have that kind of experience. But then I also really enjoy having my code reviewed by somebody that's brand new to the organization, because I invariably learn something from them as well. And sometimes it's as small as, wow, I didn't do a very good job commenting my code, but sometimes it's really something very fundamentally interesting about a new technique that I didn't know. So our code review process encompasses everyone in the organization is available to participate as a code reviewer. Everyone in the organization.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is that you just made? The code could work. The code could work flawlessly, but if it's not documented to where someone else can come in and understand it and support it in the future, then you haven't achieved your goals.
That's right.
Monty, I want to make sure if Anton, you had something you were going to present, right? We're chatting here.
A couple of screens here, and I'm going to keep this to a real minimum. We don't want to have a lot of PowerPoint to death and that kind of thing. But I do want to cover a few specific points. And one of that is how we landed on peer code reviews. You can do a lot of kinds of code reviews, and just because you're doing one type doesn't mean you might not do others as well. We do automated code reviews as well, and we actually require automated code reviews to happen before the peer code review. And you may have additional steps and additional code reviews, but we focused on peer code reviews. All code reviews are looking to improve quality. And the picture of the potted plant here is really that even a potted plant can do a very good job at a code review. The idea that a person reviews their code and presents it and rethinks about their code is really effective. They don't have to be even presenting it to a live person. They simply by thinking they are, if they present it, they're likely to find a lot of bugs. But if it's just that, if it's just one person presenting to a potted plant, they don't get all of the advantages that you can get through a peer code review. So as we were looking at what would be the goals behind our code review process, and what we could get out of it, we focused in on peer code reviews. And some of the reasons are they're really efficient. They take a short amount of time by a couple of people. They're educational for people on both the reviewer and the person that produced the code. So education is a big piece of it. We also want to be able to share our information and broaden our skill sets, but also broaden the number of people who know about a particular piece of code. You know, if somebody's on vacation, it would be great that somebody else has some idea what that code is trying to do, so that if we do need to dig back into it, at least another person has had some exposure to it. But the other piece, and this is really key, is that we wanted, as I mentioned earlier, to make the code review process enjoyable, good for morale. We want it to be something that is a positive experience for folks. And so focusing on that last piece, the good for morale piece, you really do have to establish a culture. And that culture means that everyone on the team at some level is a developer, that they have the focus to look at something and feel like, wow, this is how it should work. They may not be a coder, but development is more than writing code. It's about understanding how applications work, and we all use them every day. So everyone in an organization can act and have that role. But also everyone is responsible for quality. Everyone, the developer, the people that are really designated for QA, the project manager, we're all responsible. But there are lots of things that are fun, and there are lots of things nobody wants to do, and we should all be able to share in that as well. So these are some of the things that are part of the culture that we're trying to develop. But these are the tricky ones. You need a culture where finding bugs is good, where when you do a code review and you find a bunch of bugs, you don't say to the developer, you wrote lousy code. You say, wow, this was super successful, right? This was amazing. We found 10 bugs. The cost savings in finding those 10 bugs at the peer code review point in the code lifecycle is so cheap compared to if those bugs make it into production. So we want to focus and measure our improvement, not blame, but embrace that success is in fact finding bugs. If you do a peer code review process and you never find a bug, that is not success, right? Success is about finding bugs. And the bugs aren't always even big issues. Sometimes they're, just as Monty and I discussed earlier, it could be documented better. It could be more maintainable, and all those kinds of things. And so I do a larger presentation on this, but really watching a code review in process, seeing one happen is more fun, really, than me stand here and present a bunch of slides. But it's also more effective to sort of see what that looks like. And I'm going to talk a little bit, just for a moment, the next to last bullet here is we want to measure our success. That's something that we thought was really important. So what we did was we developed a really quick Apex application for measuring each of our code reviews. And we consider it so important that we write into our contracts with our clients that we are going to do this. We are going to do code reviews. We're going to keep track of them, and we'll let you know how much time we spend in code reviews and how many bugs and defects we find and fix due to those code reviews. So we've got a quick little checklist, or a quick little form that every time we do a code review, we just run through a quick, how many defects were fixed, how many did we find, but they're yet to be fixed, if there are any news stories. And this is the key element here, non-functional improvements, right? Those are things like, improved comments, or just a change to the way the code was written to make it more maintainable, those kinds of things.
Anton, do you mind if I ask a quick question here?
Go
so
right.
So you mentioned that this is part of our contract. So I'm still a little bit new to our process. I'm curious, do you ever get pushback from clients around this?
It's interesting. We don't. And one of the reasons we don't is we tell them quite honestly that this will save them money. And in fact, if they don't want us to implement the peer code review process, they should add 10% to our estimate, because we feel, and we can demonstrate that the amount of rework that will happen because we're not doing this will actually add to the cost of the project. And it's well documented that that's the case. So if there's initial pushback and we tell them, well, okay, you don't want to do the peer code review process, add 10%, that usually solves it.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
But the reality is borne out by the numbers. We consistently show that we very efficiently, find additional bugs that wouldn't have been found otherwise. The other thing that we want to make sure that we do is we want to make sure that we have a little bit of a pre-check. We want them to, in fact, run an Apex Advisor beforehand. And this is just a sample of data of what we have. It's not our full checklist and so forth. We also have a quick agenda. We publish our agenda. And one of the items on that agenda, and this is legitimate, is turn on the camera, talk about the weather, your kids, get to know your teammates, particularly in the times that we're in right now, where you're feeling isolated and so forth. A code review turns into an opportunity to interact with somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of our documented agenda is to spend 10% of your code review just chatting. The other thing that we want to do, though, is we want to keep track of not only the results of the code review, but how the code review process is itself. Do people like the code review process? Are there things they would change about it? And we've had lots of little changes that come about. Everything from as small as changing the radio buttons to be pills, right? People like the pills better, so we changed that. But we've had bigger things as well that have come out of this about how to improve our process. And we keep track of what people think about it. Do they think the process is good? Do they think it's great? Are they, they don't like it? These are things that we wanted to keep track of. So we built this little app. It's not the greatest Apex app you're ever going to find, but it doesn't need to be. What we did was we said, these are the key elements that we want to track. It gives you a checklist to follow, and we track the actual peer code review process itself. And we spend a couple minutes doing that with each one. And
Anton, we've got a link to this, right? This is an app that we're sharing with people on the call today.
We do. We've published
Okay.
this right here. It's a little GitHub repository. It's got the application as well as a little administrative application, and we've got a sample checklist, both for Apex and PL SQL. And you can add to your own. You can add to these and define your own standards. And we actually, I think we're also sharing some of our coding standards as part of this. So,
yeah.
So I've already taken more time than I want to away from Rich and Lance. So I'm going to stop right there, but I'm happy to stay on after and talk and that kind of thing. So Rich and Lance, sorry for eating into your time. I'm going to stop right there.
No, that's quite all right, Anton. I really, I'm glad you were able to take some time with us and kind of lay in this foundation. We are going to go to the main event now, and Anton, if you would hang around during their session, I would appreciate it. We are going to go to the main event. Rich, I've known Rich for quite a while. I haven't known Lance for as long, so it's great that he was able to join us as well. Rich got an extensive background, worked for Oracle in the past, and just very, very knowledgeable. Somebody I really have come to admire and really enjoy learning from him on a daily basis. So I appreciate you being able to do this for us, you and Lance. Rich, we're going to talk about code reviews again. If you have some questions in the audience, if you have some questions, get your questions asked. We'll get them answered. There's the Q&A tab in the bottom. But other than that, Rich, Lance, I'd like to hand the ball to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about code review.
Sure. So what we're going to start, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give you guys a little bit of a background here. And the background was we have a client that deals with regulations, and they produce rulings against individuals. And they had a system in place for many, many years, like 30 plus years, Oracle Forms, and they're gradually moving things to Oracle Apex. And that project is pretty much finished up. And in one of the discussions with some of the developers on the team there, they had been using a ruling number column in a table to produce a ruling number. Ruling number 100 is a ruling against this individual. And the Oracle Forms application was written a very long time ago, not by us. And it was written in a way that they produced the next ruling number by selecting the max ruling number from the table and adding 1. And anybody who has done any real database development knows that's probably not the right way to do things. So the other thing is that they wanted to go into their application and create real true surrogate primary keys on their tables to be able to build better relationships between their tables. So one of the developers came to us and said, hey, I've written this trigger to implement that logic into the application. And basically, we sat down with the business and we determined that going forward, rather than selecting the max ruling number and adding 1, we're just going to use our surrogate key column as the new ruling numbers going forward, as long as the application isn't being used through Oracle Forms. So if it's being used through Apex, that's how we're going to do it. The Oracle Forms stuff needs to be there to have Oracle Forms continue to work until they're completely migrated off of it. And then eventually, maybe they could get rid of it. So they could get rid of the ruling number and just stick with the ruling ID, maybe at some point down the road. But they have hundreds of thousands of historical ruling numbers that they needed to keep track of. So kind of a lot going on. The developer came to us and said, hey, I've written a trigger, I've tested it out, it does what it needs to do. Can you take a look at the code for us? And so Lance and I kind of took a look at it and said, hey, let's take a look at it. We know the code works. There's effectively no actual bugs in the code. It does what the business needed it to do. But we thought potentially there might be an opportunity for improvement. So, bring up the code. Hey, Lance, here's the trigger that's written. What type of feedback would you have on this?
Yeah, so the first thing I see is just that I'd like to leave everything as it is, but just reformat it so it's a little bit quicker to look at and see what's actually going on.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think messy code like this is actually much harder to maintain and support. And just simple formatting to line stuff up correctly, or not necessarily correctly, but in a way that kind of makes sense and makes the code more readable is good. And so I'm just going to take a little, now that we've kind of fixed the formatting a little bit, I'm going to take a look at the actual code and look at what it is, right? So we've got a trigger. Apparently it's named the ruling number before insert row trigger on the rulings table. And for every row, we have a couple of local variables that are anchored to the base table. So that's good. And it looks like we've got, we're selecting a sequence next value into a local variable and then assigning it to the new ID. And then we've got a ruling number, and it looks like we're selecting the previously assigned ID value into a local ruling number and setting the new ruling number equal to the value that was selected out of, that was selected into the ruling table. So or excuse me, selected into the local variable. So although this works, what do you think, Lance?
Yeah, so I would not, I don't think we need to be selecting from dual. I think we can just do direct assignment here.
Yeah,
So,
this is
yeah,
like needless work, right?
right. Yeah, we
All right.
don't really need that.
Somebody asked in the chat. I don't know. I just did PL SQL is the code formatter that I'm using in this to do the highlighting in Visual Studio Code. But Lance says, hey, we don't need to do a select into. Why don't we just do direct assignment? And certainly less lines of code, a little more efficient, looks better. But
Yeah.
what's going on?
So real quick, just to, if they're asking about the syntax highlighting, there's actually an extension by Oracle for Visual Studio Code. That's what that might be. But as far as the code goes, well, since we're doing direct assignment, we really don't need those variables. So we can actually remove the entire declare section.
Good point. So let's do that. And now we've got even less lines of code, so less things to maintain. The code definitely looks a little bit cleaner. However, if you saw this type of code, the question might be, this looks kind of normal. We see this type of stuff all the time. But this here, if the ruling number is null, then set the ruling number equal to the new ID. If we were to look at this 6 months from now, would there be questions?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think, well, one thing before we get to, I think we should definitely add comments. But before that, you mentioned that it's ruling number before insert row, and I feel like we don't really need to have a ruling number before insert row. We could just have a rulings before insert row. So just name it after the table. That's one of the first things I would do.
I agree with that, definitely.
And then, yeah, like after that, I think even for me, someone who's coming into this, I would need comments to know why we're doing it. Not so much what we're doing, but why we're doing it. And then the developer themselves will want those comments as well, because they might work on this, 2 years from now.
Right. And so this is probably maybe one of the biggest things. And my standard for adding comments into code is I actually put the day I did it, who I am. I put my phone number because I'm a consultant, and 10 years from now or 30 years from now, hopefully, if somebody's looking at something and they've got a question, my phone number is there and they can call me. Sometimes people put their email addresses and that stuff. But basically the conversation that we had at the beginning of, hey, why are we building this ruling number column? What are we doing in this trigger? Why are we doing this, right? The reason is directly in the code. And so now somebody comes in 6, 8 months later, they're looking at this and it's like, oh, I get it. I see why we're doing this, right? We were doing a max ruling number +1. That was bad. We're changing things. We're adding a surrogate key. We have an existing Oracle Forms application. It might go away. It might not. We need to have that there. And once we've migrated away from Oracle Forms completely, maybe we can just entirely eliminate the ruling number. And so this here, compared to where we started, is certainly fantastically more maintainable and supportable code.
Gentlemen, we have another question that came in. Actually, we had two questions that came in. One of them is, hi, how did you DoD code formatting in VS?
So I have yet to find an auto code formatter that actually does good code formatting. So personally, I just format it so it looks good. I often try to start with an auto formatter And for simple things like this, it often works relatively okay. But as soon as you get into complicated things, most auto formatters produce code or produce stuff that makes it hard to read. So truth of the matter is, I just manually do it.
Okay, and the second question we had is perhaps a little bit wider, is how would you practice code review in a very agile team where requirements change very often?
I don't see how the requirements changing would make any difference, right? If the code needs to change because the requirements are changed, then I'm not sure how or why that would make a difference.
I'll jump in with one comment regarding that. We seek to have our code reviews be completed in 45 minutes. 45 minutes
less,
is
yeah.
or less, right? Which means that you're doing a lot of small code reviews, hopefully, and that's ideal for an agile environment. You're not waiting to do your code review until you've done some giant module. A peer code review is about, hey, I've done something small, something distinct, a single user story, and a single user story should never be more than 40 hours of development work, and ideally is 8 to 16 hours of development work. And so you're doing a discrete amount of code review, and that really is ideal for an agile environment where things are changing rapidly. The other thing that I'll just point out about our peer code review process is we do not designate the time or a time when you should do a code review. We say, we have a Teams channel or a Slack channel where you simply go out and say, I'm ready for a code review. And hopefully, ideally, and usually somebody responds almost instantly that says, I can do your code review now or in the next hour. And that gives you the opportunity to get, when you're done with something, to review it very rapidly and move on to the next thing. And so we don't say once a week you need to do a code review, or every Tuesday. We say when you've done enough code that you can review it in about 45 minutes, have a code review. And then we track it. And we do not track it in order to put a hammer to people. We track it in order to say, great job, you've been doing the code reviews, we're consistently getting good results. And that's, I'll leave it at that.
Hey, Rich, I had one question too. I guess this would go to the whole panel. Just want to get your opinion on something. It sounds like the first time Lance would have seen this code is during the code review, once the code review occurs. Do you think that there's a benefit to kind of providing context ahead of time and providing the code ahead of time? Or do you think that would cause Lance to kind of have some preconceived notions about the code or anything? So I just want to make a point that you're kind of going into the code cold every time, right?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I've done many code reviews and looked at code from many different projects and have gone in cold, hundreds and hundreds of times. And I haven't found it a problem. I think any developer should be able to look at any code for any project and be able to understand it. Remember, the goal of code, I think the goal of code is a developer should be able to come and look at that code 6 to 8 months from now and understand it, right? And so if it's not understandable and you don't understand why people are doing what they're doing and how it should be working, then the code isn't good no matter what the code does.
Yeah, that I think you answered my question there too, is that if you go in there cold, then you are relying on the logic being clear enough, and you are relying on the documentation. And that's what you're testing anyways, in part, is the documentation. So yeah, good answer.
And gentlemen, we have one more question that came in. It is, what tools do you recommend to track code review, e.g. in an agile team?
We have our code review application that we use, and we're sharing that with the community. So certainly it's just a simple Apex app, You can download it from the GitHub that was in the link there. That's what we use, but certainly you could write something yourself if you wanted, or take ours as a starting point and make modifications to it.
Yeah, we'll have the link to that. It's up in the chat, but we'll also make sure to update the show notes in the portal for anyone that wants access to that.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, one of the great things about Apex is it's super fast to make changes. We make changes to that app and push them out pretty regularly. It's, you know, it's trivial.
Yeah. I did have a couple of other things. So one of the things is, you know, this code here, I think might have become close to what went to production in the customer's application. And the reason was, of course, that there was a lot of historical pieces to the application. It was already in place. It was, you know, there's a forms interface and an Apex interface. But just for fun, we kind of went and looked at what are some of the other things that could potentially be done to the code. So one thing is, in general, I'm not a huge fan of sequences for surrogate keys. I actually like using DBMS GUID, or new in the more recent versions of the database, the identity columns. And so a couple of other little things is, so if I did this, if I took a look at this trigger and I was going to be developing this in a standalone system right from the start, I would change a couple of things. So one thing is I would just get rid of the trigger code that maintained the surrogate key and just either do it with a default using DBMS GUID or an identity column. And then the other thing is I don't like a couple of other things. So I'm not a big fan of plural table names, and I have in some coding standards, and there's a lot of history on plural table names and that type of stuff, but I actually think singular table names are actually a lot easier to support and maintain. And just to, you know, a little example here, this is, I did some work for the Texas Railroad Commission that regulates oil and gas production in Texas. And there's all kinds of well bores. And so we have master tables and detailed tables. And if you go through the effort to do plurals on all your table names, you end up with a list of tables that looks something like this, right? And if you just stick with singular table names, then everything just lines up like this, and it's kind of awesome. It makes it a lot easier to see what's going on in a system when you're not constantly bouncing around. And obviously, we have some some other reasons in our coding standards that are good reasons for not going through the effort to pluralize all your table names. I think it's one of those things that we've done in the past without really spending a lot of time to think about it. So I would have changed the table name itself to be singular. And then the other thing is, I don't like having a trigger for every single action point. And instead, I use compound triggers. So I would have put the code into a single compound trigger. Also, we had somebody else when we were showing this, Lance and I were showing this to somebody else, and they were like, hey, you have an if statement that says if the ruling number is null, then make the new ruling number equal to the new ruling ID. Couldn't you just do a coalesce? And they're right. You could just do a coalesce, right? Remember, coalesce says if this is not null, then return it. So if the user has passed it in through the Oracle Forms application or something, and then otherwise go to the next value, and the next value is, well, that's the ruling ID. So effectively, we've eliminated 2 lines, you know, our begin if and end if by using a coalesce. And then somebody else actually said, well, wait a minute. How about if you just modified the table itself and totally eliminated the need for the trigger at all, right? Where we just set the ruling ID to a GUID, and then the ruling number is just generated by a sequence. And ultimately, you know, we've managed now to eliminate 100% of the code that we started with. And these are the types of things that really help when you start here and you spend a lot of time, you know, trying to fix code as it exists. Sometimes you miss the big picture, which is, hey, potentially we could just eliminate all of the code and do it directly in the database at the table level. So, any questions, comments, anything else?
No other questions so far, but I encourage everyone to submit your questions, please.
I would love to share a comment from one of our attendees who wrote, quoting from a case scope presentation, always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. Now, nobody knows where you live, Rich, but they certainly have your phone number. You're taking, which is now going to be published, you know, you might have to do something about that. You'll be getting hate calls.
Yeah. Listen, if somebody calls me and wants to do a code review, wants me to do a code review with them, I'm totally happy to do so.
And we have one comment that came in also. You can just eliminate the SEQ and use virtual column.
Yeah, okay, except for the fact that we have a couple 100,000 historical rulings, right? So the ruling, you know, the old historical ruling numbers have to be there at least until we get beyond expired retention and that type of stuff. So yeah, maybe, right?
One other thing to get your thoughts on, Rich and panel, is when it comes to complexity. Like I really geek out on using some of the new stuff and looking at lines of, you know, looking at the total lines of code. And if I can get that down and if I can do it really elegantly and slick, you know, that gets me all jazzed. But at some point, you know, you say it's got to be maintained, it's got to be understood. So where do you kind of find the sweet spot about complexity? Because I know, look at Ask Tom. You know, a lot of times Ask Tom was a very straight line. You know, he wouldn't throw the most complex things in there. He would kind of, you know, make it really easy to understand and that. Where so can you comment on complexity? Because you can go too far, then it becomes kind of difficult to understand, and maybe some people aren't as cutting edge on the new PL/SQL conventions or anything like that.
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely a balance. I'd much rather have 5 lines of code that are very clear, simple, easy to understand, maintainable, than have 1 line of code that's really, really difficult to understand. One of the things that I enjoy using, but can be very difficult to decipher, is regular expressions, right? And so using the regular expression functions inside of PL/SQL, they are fantastic and they can eliminate a lot of code. But I find every time that I use them, I document exactly what's going on inside of the code so that, or what's going on inside of the regular expression, because there's an awful lot of people who don't have extensive experience with regular expressions. And so almost always I'll use a regular expression when I can eliminate 10 or 15 lines of code with it, but then I'll just document it in there so that the next developer that comes along can kind of, you know, look through the regular expression, have a good idea of what's actually happening there. That's
a really good example. That SQL Analytics is another good example. If you don't use it every day, document. It's great. Good answer, Rich.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that, is that nothing says like doing a code review means you're just reducing lines of code either. I mean, you could code review something that's someone writes because they have extensive knowledge, and it's a little too complex. And I mean, if you're having to write 2 paragraphs of comments so someone can understand what's happening, it might be better to just write some simpler code that's easier to read.
True,
Yeah.
true. Mark, do we have any additional comments or anything, or questions from the attendees?
Just one additional comment, and that is, remember, it's also so powerful for learning because the person who did the code review will teach a lot of information in a code review.
And in fact, it goes both ways, right? The person doing the code review, the reviewer, may end up teaching a lot, but they might also learn a lot. And certainly I feel that I do. I enjoy being on both sides of it. Something that we didn't really demonstrate, lack of time, and perhaps you don't want to hear about Rich's dogs or Lance's hobbies, but the idea that in fact the code review is about a lot more than just improving the code that you're looking at right now. It's about improving your ability to produce better code going forward, as well as just having an enjoyable work environment. And that is a huge piece of the reason we do peer code reviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Culture, very, very important. Culture can't
I'm
be.
curious,
can't be
Anton, how much do you have to do a lot of coaching in general with people? Do you get so the feedback in that system, do you often have to go back to the reviewers and sort of coach them if people have expressed that maybe they felt a bit of code shaming, or do you ever get comments about the experience not being all that positive, and then how do you address that?
So we have gotten a little bit of that early on, and I think that's essentially been eliminated over the course of the time that we've been doing these. And really, it is about having consistent feedback to folks to reinforce that everyone should experience a code review in a positive way. And at the end of it, we want to make sure that happens. And so sometimes that means picking the right matchup, right? You're not always going to click perfectly with every other person, but we tracked very closely the NPS score, the score of the process. And we consistently get very high scores for the process. And every now and then we'll see one drop down. And I'll do an outreach to figure out why do we have something? We've never had one that wasn't at least a 0. A 0 is neither good nor bad. But we have had them drop as low as 30 from a negative 100 to a positive 100, a 30. And in those cases, we do want to reach out. And that is, hopefully that's something that very rapidly gets resolved. And we haven't seen that in quite a long time. So.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Rich, Lance, Anton. Thanks for hanging around. I found it to be a really interesting discussion, and much like the first week, the second week, these are things that you can do within your organization that really don't have a cost associated with them. It's just process and building the additional process.
To the opposite effect, you'll save money.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Very much so.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you for the panel. Next Tuesday, we're going to be Tuesday, May 12th. We're going to have our first Spanish program. That's going to be hosted by Insum's own David Lopez. The discussion is going to be on deployments in code repositories. The one we had last week in English, we're going to put that out for our Spanish-speaking audience. Next week, next Thursday, me and my beautifully coiffed head will be joined by the Hudson Hornet. Insum's own Hayden Hudson is going to lead a discussion on third-party design libraries. The following week, if Anton agrees to it, the following week, May 21st, Anton, we're going to like to have you back, and we're going to do a session on zero to application. And in the span of, let's say, 45 minutes, you're going to go from like data model to a fully featured app. Anything you want to say about that?
No, but that will be a live interactive session with a participant from the audience. So we'll select somebody from the audience, and we'll have a conversation, and we'll see how far we get in 45 minutes. Talk about Agile. This will be, one sprint in 45 minutes.
Extremely agile, extremely. Well, so not to be
Slightly
missed.
scary, but should be fun.
And the downbeat will remain at 2 o'clock Eastern time. If you're like me, you think of some of these questions after the broadcast closes. So if you, when we close this thing down, if you've got questions, go out to the forum. Anton, Lance, and Rich will be out there answering your questions. We're happy to continue this into the forum. Again, thanks to you, panel, for participating. Thank you, Michelle.
That was
Thank
great.
you, Mark. Again, put a fork in it. We're done, and we're going to do it all again next week on the Insum Insider. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.